I arrived in the late afternoon, after a long hike up the mountain. The area was remote and secluded, as I had hoped it would be. There were no signs of other people for miles around, just wilderness and nature. The scene was breathtaking. Towering pines swayed gently in the breeze. A crystal-clear stream babbled nearby, and the air was fresh with the scent of nature. It felt so good to be out here again. Setting up my small campsite took only a few minutes. I found a cozy little clearing surrounded by wildflowers and set to work making it my home for the night. The fire pit was carefully prepared, with rocks stacked around it to contain the flames. A simple tent was pitched nearby, nothing fancy or expensive, just something to keep me dry if it rained during the night. As I looked around at my campsite, I smiled at how beautiful everything looked. It's amazing how much better things can look when you're not staring at them through a screen or from behind glass windows all day long. As I finished putting everything together and made myself comfortable by sitting on top of my sleeping bag next to the crackling fire, with each passing second, more stars began twinkling in their places overhead until there were too many to count. The sky turned from blue into blackness as we spun away from daylight towards evening time once again. That had been used for dozens of meals before this one. A hunk of bread went along with them, which tasted delicious when dipped into some leftover bean sauce that remained inside my bowl afterward. After eating dinner while watching bats fly about overhead catching insects, a couple hours went by while I sat there looking at nothing but trees and the fire, listening to the sound of crickets chirping and owls hooting in the distance. It was so peaceful out here, I thought. So quiet. With a yawn and a stretch, I decided it was time for bed. The night sky was beautiful, but my eyes were getting heavy with sleep. Unzipping the tent's door, I climbed inside and zipped it back up again behind me to keep out any bugs or animals that might be curious about what smelled so deliciously of beans and bread nearby. The air inside my little nylon shelter smelled like pine needles from an air freshener as I lay down on top of my sleeping bag. It wasn't cold enough yet to need anything more than that for warmth, but if it got colder during the night, there would be plenty of time to put on more layers before morning came around again. After brushing my teeth with some water from a bottle which had been left in the sun all day long, making it warm enough for rinsing, I lay back down once more and closed my eyes, ready for sleep, which would surely come easily. After such a long day spent hiking through mountainsides covered in thick forests full of trees as tall as buildings, suddenly the tranquility of the night was abruptly broken. A sudden high-pitched screech sliced through the stillness, echoing eerily among the trees. It was a sound unlike any I had heard before. It made my skin crawl to hear it, and goosebumps rose up all over me as I realized how close by it had been. The scream came again a few seconds later, just as loud and piercing as before. My heart was pounding in my chest now as I tried to figure out what could have made that sound. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard from an animal before, not even from a human being for that matter. I jolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was so loud it had woken me up from a deep sleep, and I sat there for a moment, disoriented and confused. My eyes went to the tent's door where I saw the zipper was undone. Peering out into the moonlit night, I tried to discern what could have made that noise, but there was nothing to be seen at first. The forest was dense and shadowy in all directions, trees as far as the eye could see. I was in a valley between two mountainsides which stretched out for miles around us on all sides. Another screech came from nearby, much closer than before, and this time I saw movement coming from behind one of the trees just outside of my campsite. It looked like something small at first, maybe a raccoon or even an owl. But then it made another noise which sounded more like an animal than anything else. Hoo-hoo. I laughed out loud with relief when I realized what it must be. An owl? Of course, what else would make that kind of sound? But as soon as that thought occurred to me, another part of my mind began questioning whether or not that could really be true. The screeches continued to come from different directions now, growing louder with each passing second. It sounded like there were several of them calling back and forth with one another now. And yet, even though they were so close by, there was still nothing visible that would explain what could have been making those noises. My heart rate increased once again. As fear began creeping into my thoughts once more. What if it wasn't an owl? What if it wasn't any kind of animal at all? "Who's there?" I called out nervously after a minute had passed, without any further sounds being heard aside from those creepy shrieks coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But there was no answer. The screeching continued, growing louder and more piercing with each passing second. It sounded like a chorus of voices coming from all around us now, as if I was surrounded on all sides by whatever this thing was that was making these sounds. My mind raced to try and figure out what it could be. A bird? An owl? Some kind of nocturnal creature I wasn't familiar with? The fear began to rise up inside me once again, a cold grip tightening around my chest as I heard the screeches coming from just beyond the trees in every direction now, circling my campsite. Whatever it was, there were definitely more than one of them. That much I knew for certain, and they were moving closer to me with each passing second. And then suddenly, everything went quiet once again. The only sound which could be heard was my own heart thumping loudly in my chest. As I sat there listening intently for any sign of movement or noise from outside my tent's thin nylon walls, I sat there for a long time as I tried to make sense of what could be making those noises. It was hard to believe that an owl could sound like that. But then again, the night was full of strange sounds, and this was a wilderness area after all. There were bound to be some nocturnal creatures I wasn't familiar with. The sounds began again, and this time they were even closer than before. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening intently as whatever it was made its way around the perimeter of my tent once more. The screeches came from just outside now, so close they sounded like they were only feet away from me. My heart raced as I listened to them moving around out there. Whatever it was seemed to be circling me in slow, deliberate steps. And then suddenly, everything went quiet once again. For several minutes, there was nothing but silence outside and inside the tent, where I lay frozen with fear beneath my blankets. Then a few more minutes passed by, and still nothing happened. After half an hour had gone by without any further noise or movement from whatever it had been, which had been making those sounds outside, I finally began to relax a little bit. Maybe it had just been curious about me. Or maybe it hadn't even known I was here at all. Whatever it had been, it seemed like it might have moved on now. But then something else occurred which sent shivers down my spine. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness just beyond where I knew the trees would be if not for their invisibility due to how late at night, morning it currently was, and how deep into sleep deprivation territory we'd entered. They blinked open and closed intermittently, always at a distance from me but never too far away either, coming into view for only brief moments before disappearing back into the shadows once more. I stared at them, my heart racing in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. They were faint and hard to see but unmistakable, a pair of glowing orbs like those of a nocturnal predator. My mind went immediately to wolves or coyotes, but these eyes were too big for that, and they were higher up off the ground than any wolf or coyote would be able to reach. It was as if whatever this thing was, it was standing on two legs. But that couldn't be right, could it? I blinked my eyes and shook my head, trying to clear away the sleep from them, which must have been causing me to see things which weren't there. But when I looked again, the eyes were still there, staring back at me from out in the darkness beyond where I knew the trees would be. If not for their invisibility due to how late at night/morning it currently was, and how deep into sleep deprivation territory we'd entered. With a start, I realized they had moved closer now, much closer than before, and now they were just outside of where my tent's flimsy nylon door would have been if it hadn't come unzipped earlier. Without anything happening aside from those glowing orbs continuing to watch me intently from just outside where my tent's door should have been. There was no answer. The eyes continued watching me for several minutes more before finally moving away again, disappearing into the woods with each step until they could no longer be seen, even by squinting hard and straining one's vision in an attempt at making out shapes through total blackness. Or so it seemed anyway. After that long moment had passed and nothing else happened either inside or outside my tent's thin nylon walls, my heart rate began slowing down again. and I began to breathe a little easier. Maybe it had just been curious about me. Maybe it hadn't even known I was here at all. But then, after another long moment of silence had gone by, the screeching sounds began again. This time they were coming from a different direction, now much closer than before. I sat there in my sleeping bag, clutching the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other, too terrified to move or make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard now that I thought for sure whatever this thing was would be able to hear it. It felt like my whole body was trembling with fear as I listened to those horrible shrieking sounds coming from just outside once more. Hours passed by in this way, with me sitting there frozen and unable to move or make any kind of decision as to whether or not staying inside the tent would be safer than venturing out into whatever this thing was, which seemed hell-bent on tormenting me that night. As the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness, I finally started to feel a little bit safer. The sun was coming up soon, and with it would come other people who had been camping out in the area. And if they were around, surely this thing would leave me alone. But then again, what if it didn't? The thought occurred to me that maybe this creature was just biding its time, waiting for me to leave my tent so it could attack me when I was most vulnerable. But as the sun continued its ascent into the sky, casting long shadows on all sides and lighting up the forest with its golden glow, nothing happened. The eyes were gone now, vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, and whatever that thing had been which was watching me from outside my tent all night, it seemed like it wasn't there anymore. Finally, after another half hour or so of sitting there in terror-stricken silence, clutching my knife and flashlight tightly in each hand, I decided it must be safe enough to venture out of my tent again. The forest felt more ominous now than ever before, like a haunted place filled with unseen dangers, lurking behind every tree trunk and bushel of leaves. But still nothing came for me as I packed up my gear hurriedly and got ready to leave this place far behind. Not even another glimpse did I get of those glowing green eyes, which had been watching me from out in the woods all night long. And yet somehow, despite not seeing them anymore, despite not being able to hear them screeching at one another back and forth across what sounded like miles upon miles of wilderness, somehow I knew they were still out there somewhere. And that gave me chills just thinking about it. I packed up my campsite quickly, not wanting to stick around any longer than I had to. Despite being exhausted, both physically and emotionally, there was a determination in me now to continue on with my journey, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever that thing was which had been watching me from outside of my tent all night. When I hoisted the backpack onto my shoulders and took one last look at the clearing, it was with an undeniable feeling of unease. The memory of those glowing eyes and the unearthly screeches still lingered in the back of my mind like a bad dream, refusing to go away no matter how hard I tried to shake it off. With a deep breath, I turned away from the campsite and began making my way down the trail again. And as soon as I did, the feeling went away slightly. It was like whatever this thing was which had been tormenting me all night long. It couldn't follow me now that I'd left its territory behind. But then again, maybe there were more than one of them out here. Maybe these things were everywhere. That thought made me shudder involuntarily as another gust of wind blew through the trees overhead. A flock of birds took off into flight from somewhere nearby, their wings flapping loudly above me for a few moments before they disappeared into the distance. I hiked for hours after that, not stopping until I was far away from the clearing where I'd camped the night before. The deeper into the mountains I went, the more rugged and steep the terrain became, and yet there was still no sign of any other people on these trails, just like there hadn't been for days now. As I made my way down a particularly steep incline, using my hands to scramble over rocks and tree roots and keep myself from losing my balance, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. It was so strong this time that I stopped in my tracks involuntarily. My heart began to race as sweat poured down my face and back despite the chill in the air. And then it hit me. The feeling reminded me of something. The creature from last night. Whatever that thing had been which had been watching me from outside of my tent all night long, it was still here with me. There was an undeniable sense that something unseen was lurking nearby, watching me with those glowing green eyes. I turned slowly in a circle as if expecting to see it somewhere close by, readying myself for another sprint through these woods if need be. But whatever it was that had been watching me so intently just moments ago seemed to have vanished now. Or perhaps it had never really been there at all. Perhaps this whole thing had just been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion. No, that couldn't be right. There's no way what happened last night could have just been some kind of dream or illusion. It was too real, and the fear I'd felt, it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. Just thinking about it made me shudder involuntarily, despite the heat and humidity of the day. I continued on with my journey after a few minutes of standing there, frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, but at least now I could move again without feeling so vulnerable and exposed. It took an hour or so more to reach the bottom of this valley, which had been carved out by a river flowing through here many thousands of years ago. When I finally arrived at its banks, I stopped to look around for a good place to cross over to the other side. The water was moving quickly here, much faster than it had been upriver near where my campsite had been last night, and it looked like there were some rapids up ahead as well, which would make crossing even more difficult if I didn't do it soon, while things were still relatively calm here. After searching up and downstream for several minutes, looking for any signs that other hikers might have come this way recently, I found what looked like an old deer trail leading down towards the water's edge from somewhere nearby. It wasn't much, just 2 narrow logs laid across from one side to another, near where this trail ended abruptly at the bank of the river. But they would be enough to get me across if I took my time and used them carefully as stepping stones. I stepped onto one log first with my left foot after testing its stability by giving it a little bounce with one hand while holding on to an overhead branch with my right hand for support, which spanned most of this section between 2 large rocks jutting out from either side like islands in midstream. The thing beneath me began to sway back and forth, its center of balance changing as I moved further out toward the middle of the river. My heart raced in my chest as I tried to keep my balance, my arms flailing like a tightrope walker looking for something to grab onto. But there was nothing but air all around me and water rushing past below. I looked down into the rapids beneath me and felt a chill run through me like ice water. The current was moving quickly here, much faster than it had been upriver near where I'd camped last night, and if I fell in now, there would be no chance of survival. The thing beneath me shifted again as more weight was added to one side, pulling it downwards at an angle and making it even harder to keep from falling off. As adrenaline surged through my veins, giving me a jolt of energy which allowed me to regain my balance for just a moment longer. But then, that moment passed, and with it went any hope of staying upright on this narrow beam which spanned the river between 2 large rocks jutting out from either side like islands in midstream. I fell sideways into the water with a splash which sent droplets spraying up all around me. The icy cold liquid rushed over the top of my head, filling up my mouth and nostrils with its frigid embrace as I gasped for air in shock. And then came the sound again, like fingernails on a chalkboard or metal scraping against metal. The same unearthly screeching noise from last night returned. As I continued through the forest, my heart was in my throat as I trudged through the dense forest, the canopy above thick and moss-covered. It was like walking through a green tunnel, with only speckles of light penetrating to touch the forest floor. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. It was a smell that should have been comforting to me, one I'd grown up with, but instead it made me feel anxious. As I navigated through the underbrush, that feeling of being watched grew stronger and more persistent. It felt like eyes were boring into my back from every direction, making it difficult to concentrate on anything else. It's hard to describe what it feels like when you're truly alone in nature, when there's no one around for miles except for you and your thoughts and something else you can't quite see or hear, but which is always just out of reach. You start to feel things after a while, and not just little things either, big things that make you want to turn tail and run as fast as your legs will carry you. An oppressive sensation hung in the air around me now, making it difficult to breathe normally. The hair stood up on the back of my neck as if electrified. Occasionally, those screeches would come out again from somewhere nearby, or maybe far away. It was impossible to tell anymore, since they seemed so distant, yet also right beside me at times. Each time they called out, it sent shivers running down my spine. They were becoming more frequent now, too. No longer separated by hours or even minutes, but mere seconds apart sometimes. One thing I did notice about them which bothered me immensely. Each call seemed slightly different than the last, a bit more human-like perhaps. The pitch was wrong for a bird, and they were too loud and too close to be coming from any animal I knew of. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease as I continued on through the woods, but it was difficult. My mind kept going back to those sounds, those terrible, awful sounds, which seemed so out of place in this otherwise serene wilderness. This was their home, though. Whatever they were, I had to remind myself of that fact over and over again as I walked. And then I would hear another call echoing out from somewhere nearby, and all thoughts of reassurance would go straight out the window. The forest's natural symphony of bird calls and rustling leaves did little to drown out my own increasing dread. Determined to shake off the fear, I quickened my pace, my feet crunching over fallen leaves and twigs as I went. Despite the increased speed, the sensation of being followed clung to me like a shadow. I glanced back frequently, my eyes searching the dense foliage for any sign of pursuit, but finding nothing concrete. The forest was silent for long stretches now. No more bird calls or screeches could be heard. Just that awful quiet that made it feel like something was creeping up on you from behind at all times. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just a few strange sounds in an otherwise peaceful place. But those screeches had sounded so close, and that feeling of being watched hadn't gone away no matter how much I wished it would. The wind blew through the trees and sent shivers down my spine, as if someone were whispering in my ear. "Get out," a voice whispered in the breeze. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there except for me and the trees. "Get out," the voice called again from somewhere nearby, sounding angry this time, almost threatening. My heart raced as I looked around, but still saw no one there. And then another sound came from somewhere nearby. This time it wasn't a human voice at all, but something else entirely, something monstrous. Eventually I stumbled upon a cabin while exploring deeper into the forest. It was an old, weathered building with wooden walls that were beginning to rot and sag in places. The roof was covered in moss, and it looked as though it had been abandoned for years, if not decades. I approached cautiously. The door swung open with a creaking sound that made me jump slightly. Inside it was dark and musty, with dust motes dancing in the beams of sunlight filtering through the broken windows. I took a deep breath of the stale air, which smelled faintly of mildew and decay. The walls were covered in old writings, cryptic symbols carved deeply into the wood around me. Diagrams showed strange creatures with multiple limbs or heads, some resembling birds or deer, but others looking like nothing from this world at all. There were also notes written on these walls, hastily scrawled words that appeared to have been written by someone who was terrified out of their mind. "Beware. Do not go higher. It is watching us. The Guardian does not want you here. Turn back now before it's too late." These were just a few examples, but there were countless more warnings like them covering every inch of available space on these walls. It seemed clear to me now what those screeching sounds had been coming from earlier. This place felt like it was alive somehow, filled with an energy that made my skin crawl just being inside its confines for only a few seconds. I backed away from those writings quickly, feeling as though they might reach out and grab hold of me if I got any closer. But then something caught my eye near where I'd entered. Another set of writings, newer than these ones somehow. They appeared to be much fresher than everything else around them, as though they had been written only days ago. I walked over to them and squinted in the dim light, trying to make out the words. The handwriting was difficult to read. "Hurry. Leave now. It's coming for you." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words and looked around the cabin again. I turned around and walked out of the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and turn with a life of their own. The wind blew through the trees again, making them creak and groan as they swayed back and forth. But this time, there were no screeching sounds coming from above, no voices calling out to me from somewhere in the distance. My mind raced as I pieced together what I had seen on those walls. The Guardian does not want you here. It is watching us. Turn back now before it's too late. Each step away felt heavier than before, as though something was trying to hold me back to keep me here for some reason. I shook my head violently at these thoughts. They were just paranoid delusions brought on by a sleepless night spent tossing and turning in this god-forsaken forest. As the sun began to set, I knew I would have to make camp soon. I found a small clearing and decided it would do. There was a pile of rocks in the center that looked as though it had been used for a fire pit before, so I cleared away any debris and got to work building up the stones into a makeshift ring. By the time night fell, my fire was roaring and crackling merrily, but its light did little to ease my growing tension as darkness closed in around me from all sides. I had made sure not to build the fire too big or too bright, just enough light for me to see by without attracting attention from any unwanted visitors. But as soon as darkness fell, those screeching sounds returned again. They were louder this time, more aggressive, and they were coming from closer by than before. I sat with my back against a tree trunk, eyes darting into the blackness beyond where my little circle of light ended, every sense straining for any sign of movement out there among those trees. The sound came again, that hideous shrieking noise like nails on a chalkboard. It echoed through the woods all around me this time, making it impossible to tell which direction it was coming from or how far away it might be. I would not let it take me without a fight. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a fierce resolve to survive. I would not go down without a fight. That much I knew for certain. I set up traps all around my campsite, tripwires and noisemakers that might offer a warning or a defense. My weapons were close at hand, the knife and a large branch I had sharpened into a spear. I sat there in silence for hours like that, waiting, but nothing came. I heard it again, that screeching noise like nails on a chalkboard. It was coming from all around me, and I could see the trees shaking and swaying in the darkness as though something were moving through them at great speed. Then I saw it, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. Suddenly, the creature was there before me, emerging from the shadows with an otherworldly howl. It moved so fast it was just a blur of motion, darting in and out of the firelight as I tried to get a good look at what it was. The thing had glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness like twin beams of green light. They were fixed on me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine as I stared into their depths. The rest of its features were more difficult to make out, just long limbs and fingers ending in sharp claws or talons. It lunged at me suddenly with incredible speed and agility, moving faster than anything alive should be able to move. But one leg got caught in one of my traps momentarily, and it stumbled just long enough for me to duck away. The next few minutes were chaos as we fought back and forth across my campsite. I swung my makeshift spear again and again, but each time it moved aside effortlessly with supernatural grace. My knife came out next, but every time I tried to slash or stab at its flesh, there seemed to be nothing there except air where its body should have been. But then finally I felt contact. Warm blood sprayed across my face as I cut deep into its arm. The thing screeched and howled in pain, retreating back into the darkness. I didn't waste any time standing around to stare at it. I knew this was my chance to get away. I stumbled away from the campsite, blood streaming down my face from several cuts. My hands were shaking and I could barely see through the tears that had welled up in my eyes. The adrenaline was pumping through me, making me feel lightheaded and sick to my stomach. I couldn't believe what had just happened. It was all so surreal. My mind raced with fear and desperation as I stumbled through the dark, tangled forest. Every shadow seemed like a potential hiding place for that thing. Every sound a possible warning of its return. How would I ever get out of here? How could anyone survive against something like that? After a while of walking, I found myself in a small, secluded valley nestled within the mountains. I was tired and injured, so when I saw smoke curling in the air not far away, I headed toward it. A few minutes later, I came across the little structure. It was nothing more than a quaint one-room cabin made of stone and wood. There were no signs of life other than the smoke coming from the chimney. But as soon as I approached, an old man with a weathered face and keen eyes appeared in the doorway. He must have seen my injuries because he immediately stepped forward to help me inside. The man looked like he had been living out here for decades. His clothing was worn and patched together with different fabrics like some kind of homemade quilt. He wore no shoes on his feet despite being outside in freezing temperatures. Inside his cabin, it was surprisingly cozy. There were shelves full of books lining every wall and dried herbs hanging from strings tied up near the ceiling beams. A fire crackled merrily in an old iron stove at one end of the room. The hermit sat me down on an old wooden chair by the fire before going to work tending to my wounds without saying anything at all. He moved quietly around me with surprising efficiency, considering how much older he appeared up close. The man's hands were steady as he worked on me, cleaning out my cuts with warm water boiled over his stove before applying salves made from crushed herbs that lined jars along one wall. After about 30 minutes had passed since we sat down by the fire together, he finally spoke up again after finishing bandaging my arm. "There are many stories told about these mountains," the man said cryptically while pouring 2 cups of tea that smelled strongly herbal when placed on the table in front of us. "Many things live out here that defy our understanding. Some are benevolent and others are not, but all of them have their purpose. Finding it to be surprisingly good considering how it smelled. The taste was sweet and earthy, like a combination of honey and chamomile." "What do you mean?" I asked him, my voice coming out as a croak after so long without speaking. "The mountain is alive," he said simply, taking a drink from his own cup. "It is not just rocks and trees and animals you see when you look at this place. There is something much deeper than that." I nodded slowly, feeling like he had hit the nail on the head with that one. There was definitely something strange about these mountains, something which defied explanation by science or logic. "There are many legends told about this place," the hermit said after another long pause, while he stared into his cup thoughtfully. "Some speak of an ancient being who lives on this mountaintop, an entity which has existed since before mankind walked these lands." "What kind of being?" I asked him curiously. The man looked at me for a moment longer before answering. "They call it the Guardian. It is said to be both benevolent and malevolent in nature, protecting those who respect its land, but punishing those who would seek to exploit it for their own gain. It sounds like some kind of god." He gave me a simple nod in response. I listened to his words, though skepticism was written on my face. But the more he spoke, the more I found myself believing him. But it still seemed impossible somehow, even after everything that had happened. "Look," I said finally after several minutes of silence between us. "I appreciate you trying to help me, but this is all just too much for me to take in right now." The hermit nodded slowly, as if expecting this reaction from me. "Yes, it is difficult to accept at first. You're telling me there's some kind of god up on top of this mountain, and it can control animals and turn them into monsters?" He shook his head then. "It does not control them. It is them. The Guardian takes many forms depending on what it needs to be at any given time." "This is insane," I muttered under my breath. "Perhaps," the hermit said with a shrug, "but whether or not you believe in such things does not matter much out here." His voice trailed off then, as if lost in thought again before continuing. "I have seen many things living up here over the years, things most people would not believe are possible, and I have seen proof of this creature's existence." My eyes narrowed skeptically as he made these claims. "Proof?" I asked him quietly. He nodded slowly, taking another sip from his cup before answering. "Yes, there are those who have come up here looking for trouble. Men who hunt the mountain lion or bear seeking only their own glory by killing these creatures. They do not respect these animals or their homes, and they pay the price for it." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. The hermit looked at me then with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I mean that those men go missing when they come up here looking for trouble. They are never found again. I stared at him, shocked by what he was saying. It seemed impossible, like something out of a bad horror movie. "You can't be serious," I said after a long moment of silence. He nodded solemnly in response. "Oh yes, very serious indeed. This creature is real and it has been living on this mountain for as long as anyone can remember. But why would it attack them? What does it have against hunters? Because they are not hunting to feed their families. They are hunting to satisfy their own egos. They kill these animals for sport and leave them to rot in the forest where no one will see them. The creatures who live here do not appreciate such behavior. And what about me?" I asked him quietly, feeling guilty all over again about killing the bear. "You were protecting yourself," the hermit said with a shrug. "That is different. But still you must be careful when you kill something on this mountain. It does not take kindly to those who spill blood needlessly." I looked down at my hands then, remembering how red with blood they had been after fighting off the monster. The hermit was quiet for a moment, watching me as I processed all of this. Finally he spoke again, his voice low and filled with mystery. "You have disturbed it. It is not happy with you being here." "What do you mean?" I asked him, feeling a chill run down my spine at the thought of that thing coming after me again. "It does not like intruders," the hermit said simply. "The mountain is its home, and it does not take kindly to those who would harm or disrespect its sacred ground. You're saying that thing, whatever it is trying to kill me." He nodded solemnly in response. "It will keep coming until one of two things happen. Either you are dead, or you leave this place and never come back." There was a long silence in the cabin then, as we sat there together in the candle-lit room. The fire crackled softly behind us, filling the space with warmth but doing little to ease my fear. "Why are you telling me all this?" I asked finally after several minutes had gone by. The hermit looked at me then with those piercing blue eyes. "Because I have lived on this mountain for many years, young man. Longer than most people could ever imagine spending up here alone. And during that time, I have learned many things about this place and its secrets." He took another sip from his cup before continuing. "I have seen what happens when men come up here seeking only their own glory. They do not respect these animals or their homes. They see them only as trophies to hang on their walls and prove how brave they are." His voice trailed off then, as if lost in thought before he continued again a moment later. "I cannot say why it has chosen to show mercy towards you so far, but perhaps there is something about your spirit which resonates with it. Perhaps there is still hope for you yet." I looked at him, my mouth hanging open in disbelief. None of this made any sense to me. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said finally, after several moments of silence had gone by. "This creature is not like us. It does not think the way we do. It has been here for centuries, guarding this mountain from those who would disturb its natural balance." He looked at me then with a mixture of reverence and caution. "It is a protector, a guardian of the forest and all who live within it. But make no mistake, if you cross its path or threaten its domain in any way, it will stop at nothing to destroy you." The cabin seemed to shrink around us as he spoke these words, the candlelight casting long shadows on the walls that danced and swayed with each gust of wind outside. "Do you understand now?" the hermit asked me quietly after a long moment had gone by. "No," I said finally after several seconds more had passed between us. "But I guess I don't have much choice but to believe you." He nodded slowly in response. "That is true. You could try running again, but I do not think that would be wise." I looked out the window at the snow-covered world beyond and shuddered. The wind was howling outside, and I could hear the sound of branches snapping in the distance as they were torn from trees by powerful gusts. It would be a treacherous journey back down that mountain in this weather, but I knew it was time to go. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders as I realized what had happened here. With my arrival in this place, I had upset a delicate balance, one that had been maintained for centuries by an ancient creature whose origins were lost to time. I thought back to all those stories I'd heard about mysterious creatures lurking in these mountains. Tales told around campfires and whispered among locals who believed in such things. And now, here I was, face to face with one of them. A living legend. The hermit's words echoed through my mind once again. It is a protector, a guardian of the forest and all who live within it. With a heavy heart and newfound respect for this mountain's lore, I made up my mind. It was time to leave. If there was any chance at all that the creature would let me go if it saw me leaving its domain willingly, then it would be worth taking that risk. Maybe there was still hope for me yet. Besides, maybe the hermit could help me find another way off this mountain if we worked together. If he really knew so much about these woods, then surely he must have some idea. I stood up from the table slowly, feeling like every movement needed to be done with extreme care so as not to attract attention from whatever might be lurking outside our little cabin. "All right," I said quietly, after several moments had gone by without either of us speaking again. "I'll do what you say, but you have to help me get off this goddamn mountain." He nodded solemnly in response. "I will do what I can, young man, but you must remember this is not my fight. It is yours." I gathered up my belongings as quickly as I could, stuffing them all into my backpack and securing it to my back. My heart was pounding in my chest and a cold sweat had broken out on the back of my neck. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely get the zipper done up. "Good luck," the hermit said finally, after several long moments of silence had gone by between us. "And remember, it will not be appeased until you have completely left its mountain." With a nod of understanding and a quiet thanks to the hermit, I stepped outside facing the rugged mountain landscape. The creature had made its intentions clear. I was not welcome here, and if I didn't leave willingly, then it would force me off this mountain by any means necessary. I took one last look at the cabin and then set off down the mountainside once more. This time there would be no turning back. The sense of being hunted returned to me as I made my way back down the mountain. The feeling was even more intense than before, and I knew it wouldn't be long until the creature showed itself again. A gust of wind blew through the trees and a shiver ran up my spine. Then, with a screech that sent birds flying from their perches in every direction, the creature emerged from the brush. It was even more terrifying in broad daylight, its silhouette monstrous against the natural beauty of the mountain. It moved with an eerie grace that was both beautiful and horrifying to behold. Every step it took sent rocks tumbling down into the valley below as it pursued me. I dodged through trees, leaping over rocks and sliding on loose dirt as I tried to escape its relentless pursuit. Each step I took was a battle between fear and survival, each breath becoming harder to take as my heart pounded in my chest like an animal trying to break free of its cage. The landscape blurred together into one big smear of greens and browns as I ran faster than ever before in my life, praying for some kind of miracle or divine intervention that would save me from this thing's clutches. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs pumping and my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the sound of the creature chasing after me, its screeches echoing through the trees as it got closer with each passing second. Eventually, I was breathless and injured, but driven by the will to survive. I staggered out from between two massive trees and into a clearing, gasping for air as I tried to make sense of where I was. The landscape opened up suddenly before me, revealing a breathtaking view of the valley below. The mountains stretched off into the distance on either side, an endless sea of green punctuated by jagged peaks that jutted up toward the sky like teeth. I had made it out of that dense forest at last, but would it be enough? The creature did not follow me beyond this boundary. It stood there at the edge of those woods, watching me with its glowing eyes, until I couldn't see it anymore. Just an ominous silhouette against a backdrop of dark green foliage. It would not cross over this line, whatever it was that held it back from doing so. But how long would that last? And what else lurked in these mountains? I didn't want to find out. All I wanted now was to get back home alive and in one piece. I can't explain what happened that day, or why. All I know is that I made it out of there alive. The journey home was filled with paranoia. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch, and every glance over the shoulder felt necessary. The world outside the mountain seemed different now, more menacing, as if the experience had altered my perception of reality. The further I traveled from the mountain, the more the acute sense of being followed subsided, but the fear remained. That chilling sense of being watched, it lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. I made it home. The familiar surroundings of my house came into view, and I felt a gradual easing of tension. The streets and buildings of my hometown offered a semblance of normalcy, like the world outside that mountain actually existed. It's been 2 weeks since then. 2 weeks since I went missing for 3 days without a trace, only to reappear on the side of the road in tattered clothing, bloodied and beaten with no memory of what happened. The police are still investigating it as an assault, but they don't have any leads. There were no witnesses or CCTV cameras to help them figure out what happened to me during those 3 days. And as for me, well, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget about those 3 days in the mountains, or whatever it was that followed me home from there. That feeling hasn't gone away either. That sense of being watched by something just outside my peripheral vision, always lurking at the edge of my awareness. It's like something is waiting out there for me. Sometimes when I'm walking down the street at night, I can hear footsteps behind me, matching pace with mine as if someone is following just out of sight in the shadows cast by street lamps above. But when I turn around, there's never anything there. I've been trying to get back into the rhythms of everyday life, but it's been hard. Nightmares plague my sleep, filled with glowing eyes and haunting screeches. I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. The days are overshadowed by a constant nagging feeling, an unshakable sense that some thing is watching. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination playing tricks on me after everything that happened out there, but I can't help looking over my shoulder every few minutes when I'm walking down the street or sitting at a coffee shop sipping from a mug. Every time I go outside now, it feels like something is lurking just beyond sight, waiting for me to let my guard down so it can pounce. It's like living with an invisible predator, one that only reveals itself when you're alone and vulnerable. I know how crazy this all sounds, believe me, but there have been other things too. Last week I was taking out the garbage, and as soon as I stepped outside into the dark alley behind my house, something moved fast across my field of vision. Too fast to see clearly what it was, but not fast enough for me not to catch a glimpse of glowing eyes reflecting from somewhere deep within its shadowy form. At first I thought maybe it was just a raccoon or possum rummaging through someone else's trash cans nearby. But then, why did that feeling come back again? The one where you know you're being watched? It's probably nothing, just nerves. That's what everyone keeps telling me when they see how jumpy and skittish I've become lately. But then yesterday afternoon, while walking home from work through an empty park near my house, a place where normally there are lots of people and dogs out enjoying the sunshine, I saw it again. And this time, there was no mistaking what it was. It looked like a person at first, standing in the middle of a field, staring at me with eyes that glowed like hot coals in the darkness. But as I got closer, my heart began to race and my blood went cold when I realized how tall it was. Much too tall to be human. And its limbs were long and spindly, like those of a praying mantis or spider, reaching out towards me from all directions as if trying to grab hold of something invisible. I ran all the way home after that, not stopping until I reached my front door and locked it behind me. And now, as I sit here in my living room, gazing out of the window into the dark night, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, if it's watching me from somewhere in the darkness. I keep thinking about that mountain, and its guardian, the ancient being that has been there for centuries, protecting its domain from those who would disturb its natural balance. What happened to me was terrifying and otherworldly. It was like nothing I've ever experienced before or since. But maybe I didn't escape at all. It's looking for me, and I don't know how much time remains before it will take its claim on me. Just like it did everyone else that came here as part of our group. Even now, I hear the shrieks and screams of its victims from my rescue team as it approaches. I don't know how many of us remain, but I doubt any of us will escape. Have you ever realized how terrifying a forest actually is? No matter how familiar you are with the wilderness, or how well you know that particular forest, it can always turn against you. Especially if you disrespect it and treat it unkindly like we did. I can already picture you, sitting safely while you read this from your phone or laptop and rolling your eyes at me. Let me paint you a picture. Bear with me. The paths twist and turn, and it doesn't matter how straight of a line you walk if the forest has decided to keep you there. You'll wander within the trees, forever lost, just like I am. You'll never escape. The entire time, you'll hear the screams that might be a fox, but you can't entirely be sure because something about it sounds just uncannily off. A family from the city had wanted to go camping off the grid, probably inspired by some influencer on social media, and had chosen one of the rare public lands still available. They missed their scheduled check-in date with their friend back home. Then the next day passed without a check-in before their friend finally called in a missing person report. The fool waited too long. The stupid myth about waiting 24 hours has hurt so many. If they'd only called sooner, when the family missed their first check-in, we may have had some chance at finding the family. I've long given up the search at this point. I just want to get out of the forest and return home to my own family waiting for me. I no longer see the copter that had flown over the previous days to keep watch on the search party. It's not because the canopy is too thick either. I think they just gave up looking for us. Perhaps they can't keep looking for us and our doomed fate is sealed. I need to move faster. The last scream wasn't as far away as other screams before had been. Whatever hunts us cannot be too far from me. I have thought about finding a place where I can hide, but I fear that will only trap me so that my end arrives sooner. As long as I keep moving forward, maybe I will yet find an exit to this accursed forest. There were hundreds of us that came into this forest to find the family. I don't know if we'll be reported in the news. The family wasn't, but they were a much smaller group. The only reason I even knew about the family, 2 teenage girls and their parents, is because of my volunteer position as a search and rescuer. None of the locals had heard anything more than the forest was temporarily closed to the public. The ranger even tried to stop me until I showed him my pass, and he still didn't really want to let me in. I have no clue what hunts us. I haven't seen it yet. As far as I know, it could just be a rabbit with sharp, pointy teeth. Hell of a terrifying rabbit, if you ask me. I had seen the remains from a few of its attacks, and it turned my stomach in disgust and fear. One in particular stands out in my memory. Her face was frozen in a perpetual scream, while her eyes shifted wildly from side to side. I was intrigued, much like stumbling upon a horrible accident. It was upsetting to see, yet I found that I couldn't look away. The attack was so recent that I doubted anything had arrived to alter the details. I was frozen. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath was short, rapid gasps as I witnessed just what will become of me in time. A horsefly landed on my exposed skin and chomped down, which pulled me to my senses. If the attack was this recent, then the creature mustn't be far. I increased my speed and haven't slowed much since. Everything was fine at first. Nothing out of the ordinary happened until after our first night. Quite a few of us had set up our tents close together to avoid being alone out here. We had another 3 days to finish our comb of the forest, unless we found them sooner. The forest is huge, and I could see other campfires in the far distance marking other groups that had come together. I wonder if they escaped our fate, or if they are hunted as well. Our camp spot was probably the largest, about 60 of us all together, though a few were sharing their tents, so we didn't have as many tents put together. I was one of the few that was alone in their tent, either because the tent was too small to share, or because the tent owner didn't bring their spouse with them, or both. My wife had stayed home while I searched in order to tend to our children. I missed her that first night, but now I am glad she's back home. Whatever happens, I can rest knowing that she doesn't share my fate, as that would destroy me. I wish I could call her, but the reception out here isn't strong enough to make any calls. We packed up the next morning, and I left before all of the trash had been picked up, though none of the remaining trash was mine. However, I was in the group, and I assumed the forest considered me a member of the guilty party. If I had stayed and ensured everything was picked up, maybe none of us would be running terrified through a forest from some unknown horror. Maybe it wasn't just the trash, but also how rowdy and loud we'd been the night before as we belted out songs and blasted our music, which upset some local fauna trying to nest in the trees. I didn't realize anything was off until that afternoon when I began to hear screams of pain and fear. I don't know how many dead I have stumbled upon since that first attack, nor how many still remain. We all ran to the first screams of agony that echoed through the trees. Nobody saw the creature, but we all saw the scattered body parts that had been torn apart and flung. Nothing looked as though it had been eaten, and the only thing missing were their supplies. We searched nearby, but shortly after, heard another scream. As I turned to help, an arm smacked into my face hard enough to bring blood to my lip. The hand was still twitching as blood pooled from the end. I turned towards where I remembered the entrance to be and ran. It's been 2 days now. I run full out for a bit, then slow down to a steady jog. Occasionally I stop to make sure the line I traveled remained straight. I shouldn't be lost. I grew up playing in this very forest, and I know it just as well as you know your neighborhood. Probably better. Yet the familiar trees don't seem to be in the place I know they belong, as if they move around when I am not looking in order to confuse and keep me within. I've now found a cavern that I will hide in for the night. The sun is setting, and I need my rest. Besides, it is dangerous to run through the forest at night. You could trip or run straight into the very thing that is hunting you. I think I found the missing supplies from all the victims. There's 53. Which means that 6 others are still out there running. The creature won't think to look for me among its trophy collection. It's here. It's in the cave. I can hear it snuffling around. I think it can smell me or knows that I am here because it keeps coming near and sniffing near my hiding place. Hopefully it will decide that all it smells is the victim's scent on their bags, and I can... No, it's throwing the bags to clear out the area. I'm going to post this now so the world may know what happened to us. Then I will turn my phone's light on and see what hunts me. I will die with my question answered. Respect the forest. It has had enough of our shit.